Be sure to subscribe to the Healthcare Security Cast so you don't miss a single episode. We're on multiple platforms including Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Audible, just about anywhere where you can listen to a podcast. For links to all of these sites, for links to join the Healthcare Security Cast community groups on LinkedIn and Facebook, or if you're interested in being a guest or being a sponsor, you can find all of this through one link. Check out our link tree at linktree/Brian Hamilton. That's linktr.ee/Brian, B-R-I-N-E, Hamilton. Again, that's linktr.ee/Brian Hamilton. And before we get into the show, I just want to thank our sponsors, 3D Network Technology. Reliability is our core value. Visit 3dnetworktechnology.com. And Genetech, delivering security strategies for healthcare. Visit Genetech, that's GENETEC.com. And also the Change Execution Group and 360 Life Transformations. Visit 360lifetransformations.com.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast, the podcast dedicated to healthcare security, safety, and emergency management. If you are involved with a healthcare security program or desire to be, this podcast is for you. Join the conversation as we discuss the issues that matter to healthcare security professionals while leveraging the expertise of healthcare security thought leaders and experts in personal development. And now, here's your host, Brian Hamilton.
Welcome to the Healthcare Security Cast. We're joined today by Roxanne Der Hodge. Roxanne, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Brian. It's always a pleasure to come on and do somebody else's podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I always like to start off by learning a little bit about our guest. So I will start with the question, who is Roxanne Der Hodge?
Well, Roxanne is a Trinity girl that moved here as a foreign student at 16 to attend university. Grew up in a big family in Trinidad and moved here I've lived most of my life in Canada now, attending the University of Toronto, where I did my designation in psychology, and moved to Niagara Falls and have lived here probably since graduation back in 1987. Have been out here for a while.
All right. One thing I want to ask is about the work that you do today and what's led to you being involved in the work that you do today.
You know, growing up in a Caribbean island, I think years and years ago, my upbringing was quite privileged, but there was some incidences that I would witness with my parents. They didn't have the best marriage. And I remember thinking as a teenager, I wish I had someone to talk to that could give me some kind of objective kind of feedback as a teenager. And it wasn't something that existed in our systems back then. And so I thought I didn't want to do the conventional things like the doctor, engineer, lawyer, those types of things. And I thought, I wonder if maybe there's people out there that actually do this for a living. And I really enjoyed when I could offer support to my friends as quite young. And I started to investigate that further and realize that, in fact, that was something you could do for a living, not knowing much about what it was to be a psychologist by any way, and then start to explore it a little bit further as I decided to go on and continue my education.
Excellent. Some of your experience was related directly to healthcare and working with nurses specifically. I think it's important to understand the individuals that we work with, number one, and obviously what an important contributor in the healthcare environment that security has in interacting with nursing staff and other clinicians. What are some of the recurring themes or challenges that you observed that impacted nurses specifically?
Well, I worked for a health and wellness firm for about 20 years. And what we found at that point is that ultimately, regardless of the sector or size of company or industry, in this case, healthcare, is that relationships were the number one issue. 65% of issues that come up at work is related to personal relationships. And that's interesting because oftentimes we would think, Brian, it would be workplace relationships. But in fact, it was because we're always in relationship. I often say as soon as we open our eyes, we're in relationship to ourselves, and then we have partners, we have children, and then we have ourselves in the community. So with nursing, obviously, if you think about it, when we go into a healthcare setting, what are we looking for? So we could potentially be in crisis ourselves, something's really wrong. And so we're looking for comfort, we're looking for consistency, and we're looking for safety from the healthcare sector when we enter that environment. That being said, as a nurse, you're constantly on. You're having to be that caregiver that may have a lot of concerns themselves, but you're having to shelve that to be able to be 100% available for whoever's coming through in that door in whatever capacity, whether it's something life threatening, something acute, something critical, or just maybe something palliative care, or it could be any spectrum. So I think as a caregiver, what you're having to do oftentimes is to park a lot of your issues to meet the needs of your customer, your front row facing customer. And we expect nothing but that. I think of myself when I would go in as a consultant, how people would treat me. They would treat me the same as if I was with utmost respect generally, versus maybe if I'm bringing in my 10-year-old son that's had a hockey injury and we're worried about what's happening with his shoulder. So I think there's a lot of pressure in any kind of service, especially when it's 24/7, right? There's no shutdown period. We're not going down after 5, right, where issues cease to occur. In the real world, unfortunately, it's 24/7, and you have to be on and available in, psychologically, emotionally, biologically, in every sense, to be able to meet the needs of whoever's entering through those doors.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said one thing that I want to unpack a little bit. You talked about how you have to really park your issues when you're a healthcare worker. Now, when we think in terms of nurses, what were some of those what were some of those issues that you would see frequently, or that I guess that exist just in that population?
I think, like me as a psychotherapist, I think you have a certain type of personality that generally goes to a helping profession. We're very good when we're on. Sometimes we can compartmentalize, like nursing, very well to do our job. But what you might do is shelve things that are maybe going on for you. So I think it's understanding that those people, we bring our full selves to work. I think maybe 20 years ago when I started in the field, the belief was the Roxanne that left home and got to the front of the environment, or any nurse, would be different, the different person that answers those doors. And in fact, it's the same person. So I think it's more of us recognizing that what are the pressures that nurses go through? They're having to be available. If you think about the time that we're in now, Brian, you're having to not think about your pressures at with the pandemic and what's happening with the new strain coming in. Is there the proper protocols being adhered to? All those things. There's all those pressures. And then you have to go in and you have to deliver. You have to be able to be 100%. So I think what it is to recognize some of the stressors that the nursing profession is under all the time. And what are we doing to mitigate some of those concerns for nurses so that they could continue to be healthy? Because they're always performing, they're always giving us what we need as the customer, and taking care of all the needs of, and being 1,000% available to the physicians, and continually having to be able to step up that standard regardless of what's happening.
Excellent. Now I want to hone in on some of those specific challenges, because we talk about wanting to be able to understand each other and wanting to be able to support each other, especially my thinking is in terms of security and our interactions with nurses. What are some of those specific issues? You talk about the challenges that they face at work and then the challenges they face at home. And obviously, you're looking at the whole person. So whether they allow the challenges to spill over into the work or not, they still exist. So what are those things that maybe we should be cognizant of when we're approaching a nurse, or really this can apply to anybody, but specifically nurses. What are some of the challenges that they face both internally at the hospital and externally in their personal life?
I think you have to think about what are they going through. They are Nurses are generally female, and they take on a lot more responsibility for their home life, for instance. And then so they're giving at home, and then they're coming to work. And what is their job? Their job is to give continually. So I think their stressors will be that much more compared to, say, somebody else that maybe is going into an engineering firm that's a female, potentially different kind of stressors. So thinking about that, what is happening internally within the environment? Like, I remember when I managed a couple of hospitals, I trained all the emergency room nurses. Talk about the element of what you understand, and again, the pecking order also that happens between the nursing staff and the physicians, and the roles and the pressures that they are under oftentimes, because they're doing, let's say, 90% of the work, and then the physicians, they're moving it off to the high technicality based on what's needed. But they are definitely the backbone. And one of the issues that often came up was that some of the physicians didn't have the skills, because they are thinking kind of higher level with potentially saving a life, and they're sometimes less than kind to the nurses. So what is it? Like, here it is. I have all these pressures I have to perform, and I have people obviously that, need to have the skills to perform, but they're not so nice to me. They are autocratic, they dictatorial, they maybe are one down. I'm a one down position, and the physician is not thinking about what he or she needs to do to be able to treat this nurse with kindness or respect in that scenario. So I think you have to look at that and says, okay, short term, any of us can endure that. I often say short term stress. Most of us as human beings were wired for that, but ongoing. What we found across the board with individuals coming forward for psychological concerns that were nurses is that they left it very late. So an example of that would be, Brian, what we call dysthymia, which is I'm not feeling so good and I'm not enjoying work, to, yeah, I got to figure out how to maybe function a little bit better at work, to maybe I see this nurse again 2, 3 years down the road and they've started an antidepressant. And then maybe they don't get the right support and they come back to maybe again, and then they've got chronic depression. So I think you have to look at, because of all these pressures, we have to recognize, we have to offer a lot more supports. We have to look at what are the core issues, what is the average age of those nurses, what are their concerns on a lifespan perspective, what kind of challenges might they be experiencing externally, but also internally within the medical system, what kind of respect are they being given, considering, and really, I think if anything, the pandemic has shown the value of this level of healthcare that we're under. They are keeping things afloat. So I think recognizing that, offering them a lot more support than has been done before. Mental health, guess what? It's the thing. So to offer them the ability to like have quiet rooms or to ensure that they don't go over their extended periods of time for support. We know that after a certain period of time, any of us, we can't, our mental capacity depletes after we've been on shift for a certain period of time. What kind of things are the nurse managers affording? Is it that the nurse that seems to be better functioning, are you focusing more on him or her? And thinking that they're okay, they can handle this. Sometimes those are the individuals that you have to have more of those conversations with to figure out what they need to function optimally.
Another thing that you mentioned there that I want to focus in on is you referred to the average age of the nurses. So a question that I have now that you mentioned that is when you're looking at the younger nurses, maybe like the fresh nurses right out of nursing college, or someone who's maybe middle aged, they have a little bit more experience. What are some of the different life factors that impact them as well?
Getting older, cognitively, I'm in that age category there. You're not able to function as high. You need to be able to take better care of your body. Cognitively, you're aging. It's an aging process. So maybe the things that you used to be able to just kind of whip off takes that much more time. Emotionally, you're processing things, but maybe not the same as when you're the 25-year-old nurse or 35-year-old nurse. You're having to really take a lot better care of yourself. So lifespan wise, if you think about, say, that the average nurse is say between 40 to 55, we have to think about how old are their children? Are they, a lot of times with relationships, are they blending families? Are they blending two sets of families? Are they caring for parents? And if you think about it, most of the people in that bracket are oftentimes they're still raising their children, which is obviously there's a lot of stress associated with that, but they're also caring for elderly parents in some capacity. And you've heard probably the term sandwich generation. But again, how are they managing those things, and along with maybe potentially things that are happening at home? If they're raising teenagers, are they having issues with that particular life stage? And we know having teenagers brings a whole other spectrum of issues, but how are they managing those things? So I think it's looking at them holistically in that life stage and say, what kind of supports can we offer them, and in what way could we be innovative to offer support on an ongoing basis? And obviously, we have digital ability now. We have people doing telephonic or virtual, obviously, since the pandemic. So being able to say, I think nurse managers and senior managers has to start to say, what can we do to ensure that we keep them optimally functioning? What kind of breaks could we do differently? What kind of things could we do to help them relax their mind emotionally? If you've had multiple deaths, let's think about what's been happening with the pandemic. How are you working with these nurses who are wired a certain way for a certain reason, But how are you helping them debrief? How are you helping them recognize that there's been 5 people that have died of COVID, for instance, on this shift, and people appear to be functioning. But what have I done to help them debrief or diffuse the situation? And the models with diffusing within 24 hours, hospitals would generally call in their psychological services. And then within 72, you'd be a debriefing. Obviously, with this time and the tempo of what hospitals have been keeping up with, hopefully they're doing that more. Because again, what we know is within 72 hours of a critical incident happening, if you process it, what's going to happen is most of us will, as human beings, because naturally we can process it and then we can put it where it needs to go. But you're going to have people that have maybe had a lot more loss. So you need to keep your eyes on those individuals that much more, because those are the ones that are going to cost you more money overall. These are the ones that are going to have more incidental absences. They're going to have more arbitrations, potentially they're going to have things like more short-term disability claims, those types of things. So the more knowledgeable the people that are interfacing with nursing and are looking for what could be happening here, what is happening with say, Jane, because she's been on every shift she's been on, there's been a lot of critical things. I need to make sure that I'm taking the time to connect with Jane in a different way. And maybe potentially if I know she's had loss already in her life, or she's been through a divorce, or she's been on shift with multiple deaths, I need to keep her on my radar to be able to reach out to her to ensure that she's getting what she needs. Having that conversation, having those conversations that oftentimes HR managers and union reps are afraid to have. We need to have those personal conversations even more so. This time is showing us that we need to do that and get comfortable with it as well.
Absolutely. And you made me think of one other thing there too, when you were talking about how a lot of times when you're getting older, you're having to take care of parents. One thing that's unique to nurses, or really anybody who is in a caregiving role in a hospital, but especially, I know especially nurses, is that people who know them, once they know they're a nurse, they're going to ask them all kinds of questions. And because they're a nurse, like, you're a nurse, what do you think about this? I know that's something that happens quite a bit. They're much more comfortable, and a lot of people will substitute that for actually getting healthcare themselves, is just asking the opinion of their friend who's a nurse. As we've talked about a lot of these challenges, especially the challenges that occur outside of the workplace, what are some of the ways that these can manifest themselves in the workplace? Is there anything behavioral that we should maybe watch for, or what can you say
Well,
about that?
you're gonna look at knowing personalities, Brian. Like with your staff, do you know them? I think I talk a lot about authenticity in leadership, and I think managers and supervisors and senior leadership have to really start to say, how are people getting to know me? Do they just know me when things are critical, and I'm having to come to the unit to deal with things, or are you really getting to know people? Because I think that becomes very important. That being said, a lot of people don't have downtime now because of what they're dealing with in hospitals, but you have to even make it more of one of those things where you meet more often to be able to address concerns. And more is better at this point because people are dealing with a lot more. And I know I'm talking about this, and people are probably listening and going, how are we going to do that? But if you don't take the time now, what I've heard in my practice or any of my training or speaking events with related to psychological services is that we are already seeing the impact of the increase in mental health. So if we don't do it along the way and we hold our breath and get through it, what are we going to be left with? Let's say the vaccine gets going and come the fall, we're going to see things slowly opening up again. That's when it's almost like the crisis is open and this sector, they're going to start to breathe. And guess what? Then we're going to see that most people are going to start, a lot more people having issues with mental health, taking more time off, and potentially even going off on short-term leave.
Okay, now you did talk about it from the leadership perspective, but just as a colleague, again, I'll use the example of a security officer, a frontline security officer. What can we do to support our colleagues throughout these times, throughout these challenges, or if we see a change in behavior, we don't necessarily have the position to say, okay, maybe this person needs some additional resources, but what can we do to be a good partner, and what can we do to help?
See, I'm always of the belief that joint roles. If I understand your role, Brian, let's say you're coming into security and I'm always the nurse in ER or whatever, getting to just know who you are, I think is the best inoculative factor. Because if I know Brian's got 2 young children, he just moved in the area or whatever, that affords us the ability to really know the other person. And then when we get under crises, guess what happens? We remember that person. But if there's no connection between two individuals, I see you as a security guard, you see me as the nurse, right? You're not, and maybe we get along for the most part, but when things get hot, people get dysregulated, and then it's the security officer is not understanding what the nurse needs, and the nurse is not getting why the security officer is just not understanding what code just got called and what his or her role is. So I think it's about having people really understanding what are our roles, like when will we interface, what is the most difficult call that maybe your staff have been through in security since the pandemic, and what kind of things have the nurses been going through. I think when we have these real conversations, and I put myself in your role and you put yourself in my role, again, then I go, wow, I didn't even know you went through this, right? Because we've been together for the last 5 months and we work 12-hour shifts and we seem to get the afternoon shifts all the time, whatever. I think just having that commonality of connection again. I go back to, if I can relate to you, I am so going to think, wow, yeah, we really had that really rough shift, didn't we? If I have no connection to you, I'm going to think, what did you not do? Okay, I needed you here and you were down there, and I was about to have a violent situation with this psychiatric patient and you weren't available anywhere. I'm going to look to the deficit versus the, wow, how are we all in this together? And I think that element of de-stratifying the silos, whether it's the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, or security, just kind of having people talk about what they need from each other and what they could do different, what people did really well. What about if you just asked the nurse, can you tell me what I did really well there? Because I'd like to do more of it, and maybe I'd want to do a little bit less of the things that really didn't work so well. So I think having people learn how to communicate effectively, especially around those times, and for us to be aware, if let's say obviously I'm an extrovert, but you see me and you know me well, and all of a sudden I'm not talking to you, that's a bit of a sign. So to try to reach out and say, hey, Roxanne, I realize you've been a little bit more quiet lately. How are things? Or anything new in your life? Or not to even bring up maybe the hospital, but to bring up something else that might be able to open up the individual. So I think just look to what you know, and if you can, try to check it out with some kind of connective kind of comment or interface with communication.
Now, it sounds like a little bit of what we're talking about here really relates to different personality types and communication styles. Do you have any recommendations for things that we could use to maybe learn a little bit more about that? One thing I like to lean on a little bit is the DISC assessments and really looking at those personalities. That's something that I found helpful. But do you have anything that you would recommend?
Sometimes it's just thinking about I relate more to people that I feel like they get me. So if I'm the type and I have something going on, I'm going to tell you. But I have many people in my lives that they're like quiet. And I'm like, okay, why don't you just tell me what's going on? It doesn't mean that person doesn't have capacity as much as I do, but they might. My son, for instance, Brian, he's more of takes it all in and then he comes back at me. I'm like, I'm going all the time and I'm talking all the time. So he goes, Mom, you haven't even slowed down yet. I go, oh, sorry. What did I miss? So I think just kind of, you can go online and you can say, okay, what if I think I'm more of an introverted person? And what an introverted person is just means that I get my energy internally. I prefer to be by myself to get energy. And an extrovert is somebody that loves to be around people that get their energy that way. So you can just go into basics about my personality. I think I'm like this or this. And oftentimes, if you put it in Google and if you can go to something like Psychology Today, for instance, would be a good reference. You do a little quick assessment. If someone's completely different from me, it's going to be harder for me to relate. So it's about thinking if someone is very different, what could I do to try to communicate a little bit different from them? So with my son, I'll say, okay, mom's going to be quiet now. You talk for a while, and then I'm going to tell you what I heard. And so I think it's really trying to challenge yourself, right? Like we have people that we have completely aligned with because they're just like us. But guess what? A lot of people aren't like us. So it's in order to become an effective communicator, you have to say, what is it that I'm not getting here from that other individual? Because sometimes extroverts, people think, okay, I can't get a word in edgewise. And extroverts might judge introverts that says, oh, they're being aloof. But in fact, they're not being aloof. They're just taking longer to process information. So I think some basic around communication skills, How do you listen? How do you listen? Are you a good listener? Ask people around you. Say, if you go to tell me what I do really good with communication, can you tell me? And what's the worst thing that I do? And when I'm stressed, how do I communicate with you? And oftentimes we get the best information from people closest us to Brian because we're real, right? And that's where I think you can start to learn what's your nonverbals like. Some people they can't keep a feeling off their face and they go to work like that and they're having that same feeling and people are like, oh, what are you feeling? Nothing? Okay, what's on your face? So I think starting to look at it's not just what comes up. Generally, it's not most of what communication is, it's what's coming from your body. So to start to think about what am I doing with my body? Oh, I'm saying, hey, I'm really happy, but I'm not looking at you, I'm looking down. So to look at some basics of what are some basic communication skills. And you could, like I said, do a mini assessment of how I communicate. When I'm under stress, how do I communicate? And what kind of things could I do to make myself a bit better of a communicator? And again, we all need to learn to communicate better on an ongoing basis. So I think learning some of those basic skills is things that I do all the time with most of the people that I work with.
It's interesting. You made me just think of the story when you're talking about just how people exhibit things differently and facial expressions, hiding your emotions. I remember, I won't say who it was, but somebody in my life said to me, "You're not very good at hiding your emotions." And my thought was, like, why the hell am I trying to hide my emotions? I don't care if you know how I feel. That's I thought this, but it's just the kind of different perceptions. But do you have anything that you would recommend to help us in these areas? And the reason why I'll put it this way is because I know everybody learns differently. Do you have any book recommendations specifically?
Goodness, you know what, Brian? I'm trying to think of some things off the top of my head. Maybe I can give you something that we can put into the show notes. But I think there's a lot out there in communication. Some basics like how do you paraphrase if somebody's saying something? If there's feeling, how do you move that back? And I can't think of something off the top of your head. But what happens is just remember when we're communicating, my thoughts, feelings, values, assumptions, my upbringing, all that stuff's coming in. When I say something to you, it's going through that funnel with you. How you were brought up, you're male, all your experiences, you're going to interpret whatever I said through that vein. Then you're going to try and make sense of it. Maybe you're not going to get exactly what I said, but you need to clarify it with me to say, here, Roxanne, I heard you say blah, 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 blah. And I think this is how you're feeling. And I go, oh, no, Brian, you missed that. Because now I have to give you the opportunity. I'm hitting back the ball at you again. Go, I didn't feel like that. This is actually how I felt. So I think it's such a communication is like a craft, right? So I think just going back to the basics, did I hear what you just said? Like a bit of a parrot. You're rephrasing, you're clarifying, and then the higher level is you're inflecting reason into feelings into what the person is saying. So those are some of the basic things. And sometimes you're clarifying when you're communicating. What is it that you need from me right now? I just need for you to be quiet and listen. Okay. Oh no, I want you to listen, and then I want you to be able to come back to me with advice. So I think just some of those basic things.
Excellent. Now, as far as resources, you alluded earlier to your podcast. So, could you talk a little bit about the Authentic Living with Roxanne podcast?
Yes. So 2 years ago, I decided that I was going to, my brand is called the Authentic Connection Movement. I truly believe that if we're able to connect, that things take care of itself. So out of that came the concept of Authentic Living with Roxanne. So I basically invite guests on that are in leadership or end users, like different types of modalities for health and wellness, parenting, those types of topics to discuss what's really going on and what would be useful for the average person. And we just talk about, like, for instance, we talked a little bit about how a parent's coping at home and how do you stay productive, but also try to not lose your mind when you're trying to take care of a 5-year old, a 9-year old, and a 12-year old, all an online or asynchronous learning. So we cover the gamut of mental health and wellness and authenticity and leadership. Because I think if we're, as a leader through this time, if you're not being authentic with your employees, you're going to lose them, right? And then when you lose those connections, you're going to lose your talent. And when you're losing your talent and they're going to your competitors, it really is something that you can work on. So I cover most of those topics. And I'm always looking for additional topics of things that are relevant, that are important in mental health and resilience that people might be interested in hearing about.
Excellent. Now, what else can we look forward to from you in the future?
Well, I do have a book that I've written. It's on relationships. It would also be a lot of communication skills you can get there. And I have a course from the book, which I'm just starting to run. So that's available. And obviously, the podcast, please go on, listen. I would love your feedback. And coming up in April, I have just finished my second book, which is more around authentic leadership and leading from the heart and what leaders actually need to do to get themselves ready to deal with the ongoing challenges of what it is to be a good leader. A good leader is someone that's able to demonstrate trust in times of hard times, be transparent, listen to their internal space, and be able to be more available to individuals so that their decision making process doesn't get impacted by what's going on right in front of them. And how is it that I use my heart as my guidepost to be able to lead and learning about their leadership stories? So the book that's based on relationships will be released in April. And from that, leaders will be able to assess their leadership abilities, like how authentic am I as a leader and how connected am I to my teams. So the concept is that with the courses and the trainings that I'll be offering at this point virtually, but hopefully with time in person or asynchronous, will be where the leader will be able to be assessed about their skills and their team assess the leader based on what they're experiencing with the leader. And then the leader goes through the training and the team continually assesses the capacity or the skills of the leader. So the leader is going to get, let's say they do something on relational transparency or being able to relate, they'll go through the training and then their team will assess them again. So they'll have an ongoing sense of how they're doing with their skill development and be able to guide the leader to get the skills that they're needing. So that's coming probably, I would say, probably more mid-year.
Okay, perfect. Now, is there anything that I haven't asked you yet that you would like to discuss?
Well, I would just say to your staff and the nursing community out there that the kind of pressures that they've gone through, it's real. So just accept it. And I often say when people say to me, I'm not having a tough time through the pandemic, and I go, how come? Because it's all affected us. And the fact that you're in a hospital setting or in a capacity of keeping those settings safe, it means like you're under a lot of duress, I'm going to say. Make sure that even if you're not feeling it, check in with yourself and say, how am I really doing? What is my baseline prior to the onset in March? What have I done? How do I know if I'm healthy? And if I don't know if I'm healthy, start asking people around you that know you very well and start to think about what is it that I can start implementing now. Just before the podcast, I went for a walk for an hour because what I do more than anything, Brian, is I make sure that I take care of my mental health because of the kind of work that I do. So I say to these individuals, your mental health is the most important gift. Take care of it, figure out what you need to do, whether it's small steps, incremental steps, do little things often throughout your day to be able to take care of it because you can't hold your breath till this is done. Because that's unfortunately what a lot of people are doing. They're white knuckling it till this is done. And what we know, like today, we're getting another announcement potentially about what's going to be happening with the vaccine and the lockdown. So that would be my one word of advice. Please don't wait. Do something today and pick up the phone. There's a lot of resources. If anybody wants to reach out to me, by all means, you can reach out to me and we will provide my contact. But do something every single day. I don't care if it's for 5 minutes, just to take care of your mental and emotional well-being.
Excellent. Now, you had mentioned being able to reach out to you. What is the best way to connect with you, whether it be through your website or social media or what have you?
Yeah, so my website is probably the best. It's roxannederhodge.com. And I'm all at social on LinkedIn and Instagram and Twitter as Roxanne Der Hodge. So you can find me, or just if you don't remember, just Google the name Roxanne and you can put Roxanne Niagara and I'll come up. And you can pretty much reach out to me and we can book a discovery call, which is my calendar is online. You can be able to do that directly. So we can at least even chit chat about what needs you might have as an individual or even organizationally around the concept of increasing the authenticity of your staff and also your leaders.
Excellent. I appreciate that, Roxanne, and I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us on the Healthcare Security Cast today, and I'm sure that people got a lot of value out of this.
Thanks so much, Brian, for having me.
And this concludes another episode of the Healthcare Security Cast. The Healthcare Security Cast is available on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music and Audible, and many other platforms as well. Check out our link tree on your computer or mobile device. And this can be found at linktree/Brian Hamilton. That's linktr.ee/Brian, BRINE, Hamilton. Again, that's linktr.ee/Brian Hamilton. Or if it's easier, send me a text at 647-372-2042. That's 647-372-2042. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have or share any links you may be looking for. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care and stay safe.